Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the brief history and geography of South Sudan. South Sudan is the world's newest widely recognized sovereign state and the newest member of the United Nations. It is bordered by Ethiopia over here, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, and Sudan, which is of course to its north. And as you can see on this really nice map of South Sudan, there are a lot of disputed territories along its border. Starting up here, this is Abyei. I've read two different things about Abyei. I've read that someday there's going to be a referendum and the people that live here will vote whether they want to be a part of Sudan or South Sudan, but I've also heard that it's just jointly administered by both Sudan and South Sudan. You'll learn why in its history. There's also this chunk over here, which is another disputed area between Sudan and South Sudan. It's a whole long thing. This area is not so much, it's going along well. It's really disputed, and but not to the point where there's like too much like fighting and anything like that. As of now, it's still administered by both Sudan and South Sudan. You can see that the borders are a little bit disagreed upon, but it's a work in progress. Like I said, it's a brand new country, so the borders, you can see this whole border is dotted, so it's still kind of a to be determined border. We'll see how it goes in the future. There is also the Elemi Triangle over here in Kenya, which is just, where should the border be drawn between Kenya and South Sudan? It's not really like a violent disagreement at this point, but it's just a disagreement, basically. The capital of South Sudan is Juba, right here. And as you can see, South Sudan is sliced right in half by the Nile River, going up that way. This is the White Nile. There is the White Nile and the Blue Nile over here. They both converge up in Sudan, just to the north of here. You can't see on this map. But it's a very interesting section of the White Nile, because as you can see on this map, all these little dots and dashes are wetlands. It's very swampy, very wet area. It's known as the Sud, I believe. That's what I've always called it. I've also heard it the Sud, but I believe it's the Sud. I could be wrong. This is the second biggest wetland in the world. And South Sudan as a whole has a wide variety of animals, but in particular, this region does have a lot. This region is home to the bird you saw in the intro. That's the shoebill bird, one of my favorite birds. It's so bizarre and only really lives in this tiny corner of the world. But South Sudan, you can't really tell on this map, but it's incredibly green. Just down here is the big rainforest of the Congo, the second biggest rainforest after the Amazon. It's huge, very green, very wet. It kind of bleeds over the South Sudan border around this area here. And then up here, you can't see up here, it says it literally right there, is the Sahel that kind of stretches more along its border here. The Sahel is the region where the Sahara meets basically Western and Central Africa. It's a very kind of grassy, dry place, but also home to plenty of wildlife as well. Other than that, Sudan is very forested. There are some other grasslands kind of more down in like this section and, some up here in the Sahel, but the rest is very jungly forested. We have this mountain range down here. This is the Imatong Mountains. It's really the only big mountainous part of South Sudan. The rest is very flat, as you can imagine, with all this marshland. These mountains is home to the highest point in South Sudan right here. That is Mount Kenyeti. And I really like this little corner because it has a jungle like a typical jungle you'd imagine in Africa. Think like Jungle Cruise jungle, or like Heart of Darkness jungle, basically. Just like, I don't know, there's something very unique between like South American jungle and African jungle. I can't quite put my finger on it, but both are so fascinating and so interesting and so full of life. South Sudan as a whole is home to pretty much any African animal you can think of. It's got the elephants, the lions, the giraffes, all the big hits. It's very, very protected environmentally, which you'll find out why in its history. I also didn't mention, because I mentioned the Nile River. There's another very large river that flows into the Nile. It's basically where all the major rivers in this corner of Africa converge into one. It's called the Bahr el Ghazal, and it flows into the White Nile River. It's another important river in the country. You can see Lake No right here. That's the largest lake in South Sudan and one of the major lakes of the Nile, besides like Lake Victoria and all that. And it's just a very interesting, lots of forest, lots of savanna, very flat, and just very stunningly, naturally beautiful. And let's find out why in the history. Let's just dive right in. So, I've already covered Sudan in my history videos. So much of the ancient history of Sudan happens quite a bit farther north up here in a kingdom that was known eventually as Nubia. Once that started to fall apart in the 10th century, people started migrating around, and that's when tribes of people moved into South Sudan. There were many, many different ethnic groups that came into the area. The largest and the most well-known, I would say, are the Dinka people. They came in along with many, many other different groups, like 20 to 30 easily different cultures moving into this area between the 15th and the 19th centuries. And because of its geography, because of this very marshy terrain and all of the jungly forest areas, it wasn't really touched by any major outside powers for a very long time. Islam really took off in parts of Africa, one of them being just about north and northeast of here. It never made its way down into South Sudan. Also, European contact took a long time to happen just because it was all mostly centered up in the deserty area, kind of like closer to Egypt, and not so much down here for quite a long time. The only really major contact they had with any outside major power was when slave raids would come in, and it was mostly like Muslim kingdoms and other areas coming in because these people were non-Muslims. They were, living their traditional tribal lives and being captured as slaves. But of course, European influence would eventually come in. The first major power to come in and claim part of the area was the Ottoman Empire. This was in the 1870s, so the Ottoman Empire had taken over Egypt, and they were sweeping their way down, and they came into like the northern area up here and claimed it. But it really wasn't long after that when the Mahdist revolt happened in Egypt, and they pretty much like abandoned it because like I said, it's just a lot of animals and jungle and grasslands and people living very tribal and basic lives compared to the rest of the world at this time in history. And then the Europeans finally started to clash over this area. In 1898, we had the Fashoda incident, where Britain was coming in from the north, taking over territory, and the French were coming in from more of like the south area. It met here. It got a little fierce. It could have very well launched into a full-out territorial war, but it didn't. The British finally laid claim to this area of Africa. And, it was developed, it was administered, but not as much so as other parts of British occupied Africa. And like I said, that's mainly because of the geography. It just wasn't a very viable place to like colonize or take over, and it was very difficult to even get to. So anyway, Sudan finally achieves its independence in 1956, and they claimed this area. And the people in this area were not very happy about that. The people in the southern area of Sudan and the people in the northern area of Sudan were very, very different. The people in northern Sudan, like Khartoum and all of the upper areas up there, were very Muslim. They wanted to implement a very like Sharia law style government. And the people down here in the south, they weren't Muslim. If like there was like a major like outside religion, it probably would have been Christianity, but not even in like a major way. It was people just living their regular tribal lives. So a civil war broke out starting in 1955. The people here not only wanted more representation in the Sudanese government, but they wanted more autonomy. They didn't want to be controlled by a culture that was very different from theirs. It eventually ended in a peace agreement in 1972, but it didn't last very long. The Second Sudanese Civil War broke out in 1983, and this time, it was because of the same reasons. There are two very different cultures. The people here did not want a Sharia law style government, and also oil came into the picture. So Sudan was making a lot of money off of oil being drilled in the northern part of the area here. So, the people down here want autonomy, but the Sudanese government doesn't want to lose their oil. So this was a massive civil war. And, I always say that whenever we talk about like a very dark, very sad part of history, we're just going to touch on it, and I'm going to gloss over it for the sake of relaxation, but I'm in no way diminishing what happened. Basically, if you think of any kind of war crime or war atrocity, it happened during the Civil War. I'll just leave it at that. I'll let your imagination take over there. But basically, many, many people lost their lives. Massive numbers. It's really depressing. I don't really want to get too much into it, but yeah, pretty much think like any kind of war crime that exists, it happened during the Civil War. It's so sad. But peace was agreed upon in 2005. It was one of the world's longest civil wars, I should say. And part of the agreement was that they would split the profits from the oil reserves for 6 years until it would be reestablished more fairly. Also, in 6 years after the agreement, the people of southern Sudan would hold a referendum to see if they wanted independence. So in 2011, they held that referendum. 98% of the southern area here voted for independence. So on July 9th, 2011, South Sudan was created. And like I said, there are still pieces that are disagreed upon, Abyei being one of the main oil sites. This area over here is very rich in minerals and mining and things like that. So it's mainly over resources. And so they're jointly administered so that profits can be shared, so that Sudan's economy doesn't completely collapse, because at that point in history they're very, very dependent on their oil. So it's a give and take. There have been, especially in Abyei, some tensions where one country would, push too far in their shared custody of the land and the other would push back, but it never has truly escalated to anything closely resembling war. So, like I said in the beginning, there are many, many different ethnic groups in this area, at least like a good 20 or so at this point. And they have their differences. There have been conflicts between them. There have been rebel forces that fight against each other, guerrilla warfare movements. It has not really been a very peaceful time in South Sudan ever since, especially after 2013 when the South Sudanese Civil War broke out. First of all, the president, who's still the current president, his name is Salva Kiir, I believe. Let me just say real quick that in 2005 he visited the White House and George W. Bush gave him this hat. It kind of looks like a cowboy hat, but President Kiir loved the hat and he wore it everywhere, and he still wears it everywhere, and he has like multiple versions of the same hat now. He's like obsessed with the hat. It looks good on him. I don't blame him. But he suspected that a coup attempt was going to happen in his government, so there were clashes and it exploded into a full-on civil war, which again, really horrific war crime level atrocities happened in this region. It's very sad, and I really don't want to get into it because it's super depressing, and that's not what this channel is about. So let me just say that peace was reached in 2020. A formation of, it's called the National Unity Government, was made so that everyone living in South Sudan has representation now, and things are smoothing over. So thankfully that awful period is over. And hopefully things will start to look up for South Sudan. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. I almost want to say it's the poorest country in the world. I think I read that somewhere, but don't quote me on that. It's definitely down low in the list of wealthy countries. It's slowly struggling to build itself up. But I'm hopeful. It can only grow up from here, in my opinion. So hopefully South Sudan will rise to the occasion and be a prosperous nation one day. Really hope so, because my goodness, it's so beautiful. I would say really invest in tourism, because this could be like a amazing tourist spot to see some unique animals and some of the great African animals. It's spectacular. The wildlife and the geography here is fantastic. So I'll end it on that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. I tried to make it as relaxing as I could. And I hope my cat's having his bath in my lap, if you're wondering what that sound is. But I do hope that you have a very good